Hello friends, what's up? It's Josh Rose here again with another Last Epoch build, and today I've got a Primalist build for you, the Stormwalker, where you essentially walk around and everything gets hit by all kinds of different spell effects that you have going on, and you don't press any buttons if you don't want to. The idea for this build was to build around the Halvers set, which is a 3-piece set. That makes it so that an Avalanche boulder will drop whenever you get a spell crit. So I was just looking for ways to get as many spell crits as possible, and came up with this build where we use a number of different abilities that are instant cast, and they can be modified through the skill tree to make them instant cast, and that way they can just go off whenever they're off cooldown, and you don't actually have to press any buttons, you just run. There is a few buttons you can press if you want to, like the Fury Leap, which does not actually even have, it is not specialized, so it doesn't even have a tree. It's just for getting around more quickly. And then we also use Tempest Strike, as you can see here, to throw in more damage on single targets and get more crits for more Avalanche boulders. If you've played much Path of Exile, it's kind of like an auto bomber build in Path of Exile. Now there's a cool trick that you can do where you can take your instant cast skills, you can bind them to your numpad, so to a number on your numpad, then you hold them down and you turn off numlock, and now they will continuously go off. So you don't have to press the button. You just set them up that way and they'll go off automatically. And when you need to turn them off, you just turn your numlock back on and tap the keys and they will stop going off. And then you just run. Build also has quite a bit of freeze multiplier, so you'll be able to freeze enemies very frequently, including bosses, making it a bit safer and easier to get kills on difficult targets. And it also has 100% critical strike avoidance, which makes it a lot easier to run difficult echoes, especially when you get up into 20 or 30 echoes in a row and you're getting some of those really difficult mods. You can just go for the enemies have higher crit chance sort of mods and ignore them, essentially. So let's take a look at the skills, the various trees, the passives, and the gear. Okay, as I mentioned, we use a number of instant cast abilities. So first off, Ice Shard, or Ice Thorns rather. These are very useful for this build for a couple of reasons. One, they have a couple of notes here that let you increase the base crit chance, and remember, we want to crit as much as we can so that we get more Avalanche boulders. So these are very good for getting critical strikes. Then you come down here and you take Second Nature, which makes this skill an instant cast skill. It adds a cooldown, but when it's instant cast, it has no animation. You don't have to stop to do it, and so it can just go off. And then you can take Floric Tides, which will increase cooldown recovery speed. So our cooldown is 0.9 seconds on these Ice Thorns. So they'll get us a lot of crits and a lot of boulders and do a lot of damage. You can also take Emblem of Might, which makes them 0 mana cost, which is very useful because they're going off every 0.9 seconds. So I think you pretty much have to play this with a two-handed weapon. Now it says a two-handed melee weapon, but a staff works. And then we just take some additional cold damage. Okay, then we take Maelstrom, and Maelstrom is an ability that on its own does not crit because it's a damage over time ability. So it can't score crits for you, therefore it can't drop boulders for you. However, you can take Power of the Storm so that it will cast lightning every second, and then it will be able to crit for you. So now you have another ability that's going off automatically that can score a crit every second. We take Sudden Gale so that it becomes instant cast, and again can just be bound to our numpad and will just go off automatically. Maelstrom costs less mana, which is pretty much essential because the build is mana hungry. As you could see from the clips, we can go through entire maps without running out of mana, but there is a small drain on your mana. So by the end of the map, you may be running low. What's good about that is we also use Tempest Strike, and that restores a bunch of mana for us, and I'll show you that in a minute. The other good thing about this skill is when you're at 6 or more stacks, you have haste, and we're always at 6 or more stacks once we wind up at the beginning of the map, or the echo, or whatever you want to call it. We also take Frenzy, which seems like an odd choice, because Frenzy gives you more attack speed and cast speed. Now, we don't need cast speed because everything's on a cooldown, and attack speed actually does not increase the speed at which you attack with Tempest Strike. But what it does do, as you can see here, modifiers to attack speed instead apply to crit chance for the melee attack and the spells. So essentially, by taking Frenzy here, we're making our Tempest Strike crit a lot more. And we'll talk about Tempest Strike in a second and how that works. We have to take 4 nodes here in Turbulence, which does increase the mana cost, but also increases the damage, and that allows us to get up here to Haste. And of course, you want to go 3 out of 3 in Whirlpool to make those stacks last longer. And it's nice to have some dodge rating. This gives us something like 20% dodge with everything wound up, 20% extra dodge, maybe a little more than that. And then the third instant cast skill that we're using is Tornado. And Tornado, much like Maelstrom, is a damage over time ability, so it cannot crit on its own, but you take Charge Storm, so it casts lightning every 2 seconds, and then we increase the frequency of that lightning. Then you have to path over this way in order to take Snap Gale, which makes it, again, instant cast. You don't need cooldown reduction on this ability because it lasts longer than the cooldown is. So no need to make it overlap. That'll just make you drain more mana. And speaking of mana, there are some mana efficiency nodes over here that I would suggest taking. They help with the mana drain of this build. And you also get Aspect of the Storm for 2 seconds, which gives you 10% increased movement speed. So that's nice. We really want to move fast with this build. Then we have Avalanche. This is the reason that we're a shaman, is so that we have an Avalanche tree, because we're using a set that allows us to cast an Avalanche boulder every time that we crit. And it will take advantage of your tree. What you do need to note is that it casts a single boulder. Normally this is a channeled skill and it will cast multiple boulders. So when we crit, we just get one. So we don't want to worry about nodes like Mountain Peak, for example, or Precision, because they won't do anything. The boulder will just cast wherever you crit, and it will be one boulder. One way to modify that is by taking Alpine Guides, so you can get an additional boulder on crit. We take a couple points here just so we can path down this way. We take Avalanche hits deal more damage. There's not a lot of great things to take because of the fact that we're casting a single boulder, and so a lot of this stuff doesn't really apply. But we get a bunch of extra area, and we turn our Avalanche boulders into cold damage because we have bigger cold multipliers on this build than we do physical multipliers. And then you can take this node where you can do 20% more damage against enemies that are frozen. It might be worth putting a few more points here and maybe losing a couple points here. And then we have Tempest Strike. Tempest Strike is a melee attack that can trigger 3 different spells: Earth Spikes, Northern Winds, and Lightning Bolt. 20% chance by default. So really we're just pumping up our proc chances on a lot of this stuff. And then taking nodes like Hailstorm, where if you proc Earth Spikes and Northern Winds, you get this Hailstorm that comes down and deals a bunch of damage. And I believe that this can crit. I could be wrong. That could be a damage over time ability. There's also a Charge Stone where you get orbs that circle you and can proc more crits. And otherwise, we're just taking Elemental Imbuement just to add more damage, more flat damage to the attack itself and to the spells, which is the more important part. So that's the tree. Now let me just show you the set. So this is the Halver's Pledge set. Now I want to say you can play this build absolutely without this set. What I would do if I were going to play this build without the set, I think, is I would consider just turning a lot of these abilities into physical. So you can turn your Ice Thorns into a physical ability. You could do the same thing with these other two. And so then you can try to like stack and scale physical damage and not worry about avalanche boulders and getting crits. You could also invest more into the damage over time components of the Maelstrom and Tornado. So I think this is playable in a lot of different ways without the set. But if you have the set, then it makes sense to crank up that crit chance, that spell crit chance, and get a lot of boulders. The other thing that happens with this set that's really nice is increased spell damage if you've cast a physical spell recently, or increased cold spell damage if you've cast a physical spell, and increased physical spell damage if you've cast a cold spell. Now, a number of these abilities are both. And so you always have that buff because Ice Thorns, for example, will give you both buffs automatically. So you're getting more physical and cold spell damage just from Ice Thorns going off, which it always is. We're also using Woven Flesh, which I've been using on a lot of builds right now, just for that critical strike avoidance, extra leech. We get a lot of our crit chance here from an amulet. Crit chance, spell crit chance. The rest of the stuff is basically just filling out resists. I think there's a little crit on the gloves. And we take some cooldown recovery on our helmet. Cooldown recovery reduces your Ice Thorns from a second to 0.9. It makes you get more Maelstrom stacks. And I'm assuming that it also reduces the cooldown of the Avalanche Boulder, which is normally 1 second. So that might reduce to 0.9 also. But it helps. It gets more Maelstrom stacks. It gets more Ice Thorns, and that means more crits. Let's take a look at the passive tree now. So the Primalist tree, there's not a lot of amazing stuff in here. It's okay. We just really want to get enough points to be able to unlock our mastery tree. So we take some attunement, good amount of resists. We get from that, we get some health, 10% health, which is nice. Get some spell damage. And we take a point of adaptive spell damage there. That probably can be refunded and used elsewhere. You only need 20 points in the base class. We put some points into Druid because Druid is a place where we can find some leech for this build. So we can leech 12% of our physical damage as health. Now, a lot of our damage is cold damage, and I would actually consider, if I were playing this build further, I would consider actually maybe changing Maelstrom to physical, which I think you can do. Can't you? Yes. You can turn all your cold damage into physical damage, and that way you would actually be leeching from your damage over time. So right now we're not really leeching much from our damage over time, because a lot of our leech is on hit. We have some idols that are on hit. Physical damage leached is health 12%, so that's good, but it's not leeching on our damage over time. But it's still very useful. This gives you your leech and gives you your sustain, and then you can take a bunch of points in bark skin. And now I'm dumping points into Woodlore just for extra vitality. Then in the shaman tree, you want to get up to here, of course, for avalanche. And we take attunement, and there's penetration here, which is nice as well. Take some health. We take some more attunement. We take some cold damage and physical damage. Whenever you can get these added cold damage and added adaptive spell damage nodes, you want to take those. And then we take 8 points in elemental shrines because it gives us a bunch of mana regen and attunement, which increases all our damage. And there's not a lot above that I found useful, so that's why I'm back here dumping points into vitality. So one thing I neglected to mention is there's a node called Tempest Form in the shaman tree that gives you mana whenever you use Tempest Strike. And that's really the best way to maintain mana in this build, is to, when you get to those tougher targets, you start smacking them and you get a bunch of mana back, and it definitely gens your degen of mana. So when you get up to those harder echoes where enemies take longer to die and they take longer to run, you'll be throwing in more Tempest Strikes like you see here, and you'll get a lot of mana back, and you'll see the mana can fill up very quickly. So that's an important node to take. One other thing is, if you're the kind of person who likes to do your own thing, like you like the way this build looks, but you want to put your own spin on it, I think it would be worth trying this build with a different mastery. You can still unlock the Avalanche skill even if you don't take Shaman as your mastery. And the other two mastery trees have a lot more crit chance. There's none in the shaman tree, so you could potentially end up with a lot more crit if you were to go with one of those other trees instead. And really the shaman mastery doesn't give you very much, just gives you 10 attunement. That's basically it. So it's worth I think thinking about trying a different mastery and seeing what you come up with. Other than that, that's about it. I've done up into level 90 timelines on this build. I haven't gone all the way through all of the different timelines yet, but it's holding up pretty well so far. So I hope you enjoy it. If you end up playing it, let me know. If you have suggestions, let me know. And subscribe to the channel because I love this game and it's so fun. I'm going to be making more builds and sharing them with you. So I'll catch you on the next one.